This video was created from the Advocates in Action presentation, Disability History Highlights, Part 2, the beginning of the disability rights movement. It includes 13 slides and runs for 10 minutes. Slide 1, Disability History Highlights, Part 2, the beginning of the disability rights movement, created by Advocates in Action, Rhode Island. Slide 2, Equality, just like everyone else. There are two images on this slide. The first image shows a group of people with and without disabilities, standing balanced on a scale to represent equality. The second image shows an American flag with fireworks and the words, "You've got that right." As a quick review, in our previous class about disability rights, we talked about the fact that these rights are all about making things equal, or leveling the playing field, so that people with disabilities are treated the same as everyone else. Today, we'll be looking at the beginning of the disability rights movement and the importance of speaking up for equality. Slide 3, Disability Doesn't Mean Special. This slide shows a 9-minute video of a TED Talk given by Stella Young, which you can watch on our class page. Slide 4, Disability Rights are Civil Rights. The image on this slide is a newspaper clipping with the headline, "Court Bans Segregation in Public School Cases." Disability rights aren't special rights, but they are civil rights. Civil rights mean equal social opportunities and equal protection under the law for everyone, regardless of a person's race, religion, sexual orientation, gender, or disability. The civil rights movement in America was aimed at ending discrimination and creating equality under the law for African Americans. It began in the 1950s and was marked by the 1954 Supreme Court ruling in Brown v. Topeka Board of Education, when the court ruled that giving African American children a segregated education was unconstitutional. Segregation means dividing people into groups based on their appearance, beliefs, and other differences. The phrase to remember from the 1954 ruling is, "Separate is not equal." This important concept that African Americans and their allies fought for and won helped pave the way for other marginalized groups, including people with disabilities, to fight segregation too. Slide 5, The Civil Rights Movement and Disability Rights. The image on this slide is a photograph of people with disabilities during a disability rights march. The people are carrying a sign with a quote from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. that says, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." By the late 1960s, the civil rights movement had done a lot to end the discrimination that African Americans faced under the law, including the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. While discrimination still takes place today, it is illegal under our Constitution. The civil rights movement empowered other marginalized groups to fight for equal rights and to have those rights written into the law. Disability rights movement leaders embrace the ideals of the civil rights movement. In fact, many African American members of the civil rights movement joined people with disabilities as they fought for the same basic freedoms under the law. Slide 6. Find out more about disability rights. The image on this slide is the banner for a website about the history of developmental disabilities called Parallels in Time, and the logo for the Minnesota DD Council, which hosts the site at mn.gov/mnddc/parallels. While there are many important milestones in the disability rights movement, we'll use our time together to focus on some of the laws and Supreme Court decisions that have had the most impact. For more information about the history of disability rights, visit Parallels in Time. This is an awesome site from the Minnesota DD Council, which uses photos, audio stories, and videos to talk about the history of developmental disabilities and the disability rights movement. Slide 7. The Rehabilitation Act of 1973. Section 504. The image on this slide is a photograph of people with disabilities protesting to support Section 504. In 1973, the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, or Rehab Act, was signed into law. While other laws had been enacted before, the Rehab Act was the first major federal law to protect people with disabilities from discrimination in their interactions with the federal government. The Rehab Act covers several different areas of possible discrimination, including employment and electronic/information technology used by the government. The most important area covered by the Rehab Act is Section 504, which prohibits discrimination based on a person's disability in any program or activity that receives federal funding. In other words, if you receive federal funding, you need to make sure your programs and activities are accessible to people with disabilities. Stop and think about that a minute, because it's a really big deal. Section 504 meant that every place or program receiving any federal funding could no longer discriminate against people with disabilities. That includes things like public buildings, roadways, and even schools. Slide 8. How are laws made? The image on this slide is a cartoon video from Schoolhouse Rock called "I'm Just a Bill," which you can watch on our class webpage. We interrupt this class about disability rights to share some information about how laws are made. This may be the shortest version of how laws are made you've ever seen, but it's important to know the basics before we talk about Section 504 of the Rehab Act. As they explain in this video, a bill is an idea that someone wants to make into a law. Anyone can propose an idea for a bill, but it needs to follow official channels to become law. The Constitution clearly states that any bill having to do with raising revenue or money must start in the House of Representatives. Other than that, a bill can start in either chamber, but both chambers must agree on the final version. Once Congress approves the bill, they send it to the president to sign. If the president signs it, the bill becomes law. Alternatively, if the president doesn't sign it or vetoes it, the bill can still become law if 2/3 of Congress overrules him by voting to pass it. Wow, that's a lot to process, but here's the basic idea. Take an idea, get enough members of Congress to agree on the details, and send it to the president to sign. Once a bill has been passed and signed into law, though, it doesn't go into effect until the federal agency responsible for overseeing it creates rules and regulations about how to enforce it. This process can take months or even years. Slide 9, 1973 to 1977? The image on this slide shows a person with two speech bubbles. The first bubble says, "Wait, 4 years?" The second bubble says, "Why did it take so long?" Although President Richard Nixon signed the Rehab Act into law in 1973, Section 504 wasn't implemented until 1977. In fact, Nixon had already vetoed earlier versions of the bill twice before he finally agreed to sign it. Unfortunately, although it was a federal law, it took officials in the Nixon and Ford administrations years to develop the rules and regulations necessary to implement and enforce the Rehab Act, which were never signed during either of their presidencies. This delay was in large part caused by other interest groups who complained about the costs of ending discrimination against people with disabilities by making things accessible. Despite the historic Brown v. Board of Education Supreme Court decision in 1954, many of these interest groups still argued that segregation was okay when it came to people with disabilities. This delay in enforcing the Rehab Act continued into President Jimmy Carter's administration and led to one of the most powerful yet little-known protests in disability rights history, the 1977 sit-ins. Slide 10, the 504 sit-ins. This slide shows a 19-minute video about the 504 sit-ins that took place in 1977. You can watch this video on our class page. Slide 11, let's talk about the sit-ins. Question 1. Do you think the government would have signed the regulations to implement Section 504 if people didn't speak up and hold sit-ins? Slide 12. Let's talk about the sit-ins. Question 2. Why was it important for people with disabilities to be the ones who spoke to government officials about Section 504? Slide 13. Let's talk about the sit-ins. Question 3. Is there anything else you noticed or want to share after watching this video and learning about the 504 sit-ins?
Produced by Advocates in Action Rhode Island, 2026. Remember, nothing about us without us.